Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time. This is Scholar Strive doing some math. Today in Algebra 1, we're looking at multiplying and dividing real numbers. So let's look at some rules or things that we're allowed to do, or look at some properties, some facts, I guess. So there's the commutative property of multiplication, and basically it doesn't matter how you multiply the two numbers, whether it's left to right, right to left. 2 times 3 is the same thing as 3 times 2. Doesn't matter who starts first. 6 either way. The associative property of multiplication. So just like the one with addition, you can group two numbers together. So let's say 1 times 2 times 3. I can do these first, or I can do these first. So this would be 2 times 3, and this would be 1 times 6. 6 equals 6. So it doesn't matter how you group them, as long as it's just multiplication. The identity property, anything times 1 is itself. So 5 times 1 is 5, 7 times 1 is 7, 10 times 1 is 10, and so on. Property of 0, anything times 0 is 0. Property of -1. So if I started off with 3 times -1, it becomes its opposite. So -3 times -1 is +3. 5 times -1 is -5. -5 times -1 is +5. And then the division rule. So if we say 2 divided by 3, that is the same thing as if we written it over a fraction. And I prefer you to write it like this, because this could get very messy. More clean. It can still be messy, but clean. And then don't forget the division rule. If we have two fractions, and remember, a whole number can be made into a fraction by just putting the number 1. Remember the division rule. Keep the first fraction the same. Change division to multiplication. And then flip the second fraction. And then multiply like normal. Okay. So remember, you cannot divide by 0. You cannot divide by 0. And the reason is, can you split something into 0 groups? You cannot. You cannot split something into 0 groups. So cannot divide by 0. So if you do run into that case, so 3 divided by 0, we say undefined. Okay. So find the product. So negative times a positive is a negative. One way to look at it is negative. So just look at the numbers. 4 times 2. We got 1 negative, so that's -8. So this one we have 2 negatives. So negative, negative. And then we have 11 times 3. So this becomes, since there's 2 negatives makes it positive. Okay? Now, when you're showing your work, you don't have to show this middle step. The answer is just fine. But just remember, two negatives being multiplied together makes it positive. One negative makes it all negative. And if they're all positive, then they're all positive. So 3 times 2 is 6. And then we have times negative 1, negative 6. Now for part C, this is the correct amount of work, the whole thing, because we're doing the first part first. 3 times 2, that becomes 6, and then we write times negative 1. So this is the right amount of work for C. Part D. Okay, so I'm just putting the negative outside, and then I'm doing 2 times 12. 2 times 12 is 24, and then the negative gets reattached. So we have two negatives, negative, negative, 4 times 10. So this is a positive 40. Okay. So I'm going to rearrange it to make it easier. So I have negative, negative, and I'm just going to say 3 times 2 times 4. So negative, negative becomes positive, so don't have to worry about that. 3 times 2 is 6, and then we have 6 times 4, which is 24. Part G, negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. Or negative 1 to the 4th power. So we have 4 negatives. So remember, if we see 2, that becomes positive. And then these two become positive. And then we have 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1. So what happens if we have 3 negatives? So if we had 3 negatives, so remember, these two become positive, and then we're left with a negative, so the answer would be negative. That's if we ran into an example with 3 negatives. So if there's an odd number of negatives, then it's negative. If there's an even number of negatives, then it's positive. When you're multiplying, only when you're multiplying or dividing. Multiplying, dividing. So when you're multiplying or dividing, if you have an odd number of negatives, then it's negative. If you have an even number of negatives, then it's positive. All right, 18 divided by negative 3. Okay, so I'm just going to put the negative outside there, and we're just doing 18 divided by 3. How many times does 3 go into 18? It goes into 6 times, and then we're going to tack on the negative there. How many times does 6, so part B, how many times does 6 go into 24? It goes in 4 times, and then there's that negative. Alright, let's move on to the next page. Wait a minute. Part C. Is this the right page? Am I on the wrong page? Oh, here we go. So I have a negative divided by a negative. Okay, so those will cancel, become positive. So positive. How many times is 25 go into 100, or how many quarters in a dollar? There's 4. Next we have negative 64 divided by 8. How many times does 8 go into 64? It goes into it 8 times, and then we're going to tack on the negative. How many times does 9 go into 27? 3. So, and then we tack on the negative. 7 goes into 49 7 times, tack on the negative. 144, so negative 144 divided by negative 24. So what we have here is this. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. And 24 goes into 144 6 times. So right now, make sure you practice these without a calculator. You should need to know your basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. We'll be practicing that all year. Try to use your calculator. Don't try to use your calculator the least amount you can. So don't try to use your calculator. Try to do these in your head. Practice these, because when we get into more complicated stuff, I don't want you to be stuck on, the basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. I want you to be able to focus on the new concepts. So negative 20 divided by 2 is negative 10. All right. 2 goes into 20 10 times. Okay, here we go. Identify the property being illustrated. So we have 4 times 5 times 3, 3 times 4 times 5. So all they did was change the order, and that would be the commutative property. That's the one where it said A times B is B times A. So this one, you can just change the order however you want. Part B, this is the one where they're changing the groups. So you can group them any way you want. So that's called associative. Associative is grouping. And then this is called the property of negative 1. And this is the zero product property, or property of 0, sorry. Property of 0. And then this symbol here represents the number pi, not the food. And that's called the identity property. Anything times itself, or anything times 1 is itself. So example 4, evaluate the expression in 2 different ways. Okay. So first thing we can do is we can write it like 2 fractions. So 16 divided by 4 divided by 2. And remember, our whole numbers, we can just write them over 1. So if we do that, we keep the first fraction the same, change it into multiplication, and then flip the second fraction. So we'll get 16 over 8. How many times does 8 go into, How many times does 8 go into 16? Twice. Another way to look at it, we can look at the top. 16 divided by 4 is 4. And then we have 4 divided by 2, which is 2. So write an example of the following properties. Identity property. So let's take a random number, and the identity property says to multiply it by 1. And what do you get? Itself. Property of 0. Let's just use the same number. Times it by 0. And get 0. Take that same number, times it by -1, and what do you get? -7. Associative property, that's different. So we're just going to take, I'm just going to say 3 times 4 times 5, and I'm going to group these. That's going to be the same thing as if I grouped these. And then lastly, 7 times 8 is the same thing as 8 times 7. So identity property, property of 0, property of -1, associative property, and the commutative property. So just to review, if we multiply 2 negative numbers, we get positive. If we multiply 3 negative numbers, we get negative. If we multiply 4, positive. And this also works for division. Okay. Make sure you know how to do your multiplication skills. If you're having trouble, get some flashcards or something. Work them out. Do the times tables. 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, all the way up to 3 times 12, which is 36. I like to do 1 through 12. So if you haven't mastered your multiplication tables, go all the numbers from 1 through 12. So you start off with, well, you could skip 1. Hopefully you know what 1 times anything is. Then you go to 2s. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. All the way up to 2 times 12, which is 24. And then you go 3, 4, 5. If you can say them fast and correctly, then you probably mastered multiplication. And this will help you remember your division, because division you're going backwards. 16 divided by 4 means, how many times does 4 go into 16? 4 times. You don't have to be masters of multiplication or division, but it'll be easier if you are. Alright, have a good day.